My name is Katie, and I'm a junior in Gallatin studying sustainable development and urban theory. Thanks to this fellowship and institutional support from the International Urban Development Association in Paris, I spent my summer in France essentially researching a public housing development that has recently come under a lot of media fire, and additionally, some might argue, disproportionate targeting by counterterrorism programs and policy in the country. So I'm going to be speaking a bit tonight about the human rights framework of this project, but first, I want to thank the fellowship board here, along with the research team of Sciences Po professor Gilles Capel, because my project definitely would not have been the same without their advisory. So a lot of my work at Gallatin so far has centered around public housing development in post-colonial spaces and what it means for people who have been formerly colonized to occupy modern cities in patterns that are still largely consistent with those dictated by some form of imperial rule. So in that spirit, I titled my project The Outer City, Laïcité and Lac in France's banlieues. In French, the word banlieue simply refers to a suburb, but in recent years has taken on new meaning, basically understood to encompass the various perceptions of violence and dereliction that surround Paris's peripheral social housing developments, but also those who people them. Their skylines are spotted with these slabs of concrete in the brutalist architectural style. These are the rent-controlled cités, which are overwhelmingly populated by North African and Middle Eastern immigrants and their French-born descendants. Now, an exact demographic count is actually impossible here because a 1978 law bans the collection or storage of race-based data. So the state obtains no demographic census and also maintains a colorblind public policy model. A lot can be said about that, but before speaking further about policy and rights, I want to start off by characterizing the tensions that really are so palpable in what might be called Burkini Ban era France today, with a story that a lot of people I interviewed kept coming back to. So a month after 9/11, a soccer match was held in Paris between France and Algeria. It was October 2001, but this was actually their first face-off since Algerian independence in 1962. And the game became landmark for another reason. It was cut short when thousands of ethnically North African French youths stormed the field, booing and some chanting Bin Laden. Now, a man named Fouad Ben Ahmed recalled the event, which was collectively received with a collective repulsion, in an open letter that he wrote to then President Francois Hollande following the Charlie Hebdo attacks in 2015. He identified himself as a banlieue resident and addressed his community's joblessness and isolation. He wrote that the problem was before our eyes, but instead of asking good questions, we chose stigmatization, refusal of the other. The split was born on that day, the feeling of rejection by the political class when we could have asked other questions. What's wrong? What's the problem? So Ben Ahmed is now 41, and he liaises between residents and local government in Bondy, which is a suburb of the notorious Saint-Saint-Denis, sometimes just called by its administrative number, the 93. The department houses some of Paris's most tabooed banlieues. I concentrated my work in one called La Courneuve. But instead of going into the specifics that I wrote my paper about, I want to speak a bit more broadly this evening about the research dimensions of my project and also what I believe can be gained by viewing all of these complicated forces in the suburbs, specifically from a human rights standpoint. So I'm going to touch on counterterrorism policy because a huge question underscoring this project is whether the French Republic can both denounce this very evident problem that it has with terror while also equally as strongly denouncing Islamophobia. The physical geography of the banlieue and its placement on the outskirts of the city, the outer city and not the inner city, also makes me interested in the question of urban planning here. How spatial segregation impacts access to rights and opportunity, how public housing can be conceptualized within rights discourse concerning living standard, and finally, the colonial question underscoring the fact that many North Africans living in these spaces in France today were either part of the imperial migration process or descendants of it. And the fact that their placement in these suburbs is still tied to this very complicated history that nobody really talks about. So this summer I worked with an organization that was really helpful with these endeavors. The International Urban Development Association is essentially a coalition of policymakers and NGOs and architects and urban planners as well, who are engaging in these questions of race, space, and distribution in cities. So this summer we were also organizing a conference on EU-wide migrant and refugee integration that was actually held in Malmö at the end of August. And I found their approach to the topic really useful to my own work. So they essentially break these questions of integration up into three categories: time, people, and space. So time refers to access to short-term needs like shelter and healthcare and social services. People refers to how economic programs can also be human-centered. So this was the tenet that I found most important as a human rights fellow, because it allows you to ask questions like, how does a person's foreign credentials transfer over? You know, what kinds of workshops for language classes or job trainings are available to these people so they can occupy space but also be employed rightfully? And finally, space, of course, refers to physical integration within city centers. And I really kept these tenets in mind while carrying out my project. It was an interesting time to be in France because I was there on June 22nd when a draft version of its new counterterrorism bill was actually leaked to the public. It essentially normalized the ongoing state of emergency that was in effect since about 2015. And so many in the human rights sphere basically feared that it would make exceptional police powers standard security measures. So under this bill, if it does pass, prefects are allowed to close a mosque without order if, quote, the theories disseminated there give rise to discrimination, hatred, violence, or the commission of acts or terrorism, which is obviously very vague and worrisome. Human Rights Watch researcher Karthik Raj argues in this article here that violating the freedom of movement of people arbitrarily deemed threats could become routine. The innocent could then be relegated to one commune, subject to unfair surveillance and prohibited from contacting their friends and family. So this is really why I find the human rights question inseparable from the urban question here when it comes to the banlieue, because these people generally exist in one space outside the bounds of Paris' central rim in the city. A photographer by the name of Cyrus Cornu is a banlieue native and recently compiled a really effective series characterizing these spaces and how physically isolated they are from the city center. He called it Journey on the Outskirts. But I found this quote that he characterized it with really powerful, and that it really kind of captures the spirit of my project. He said, territories have geographic, economic, political, and cultural centers, and suburbs are their nerve endings. They are as fragile as any entity that has grown too quickly. They nourish fantasy and reinforce a good number of questions concerning our time. So I have a couple of his images here, and I find them really powerful, just in characterizing the sort of very stark isolation and physical distance and difference between the suburbs and the city center, even though they're actually not that far away. And lastly, just on the colonial question imbued in this work, even though Algeria was France's major settler colony, the brutality and violence of Algerian war history has been very deeply repressed. Bodies were literally thrown off of bridges into the Seine River, but the film Battle of Algiers was banned in France for years after its release, and it is still rarely discussed in school curriculum. So many people I spoke to, both of French and African descent, said their school textbooks bore no mention of these tragedies. One even pointed out that these are the same schools which use laïcité, or secular law, to justify the banning of headscarves and other religious symbols inside, which gives light to a really interesting question that I explore further in my paper, that is whether laïcité can be kind of considered a neocolonial force in these spaces. So I just want to end on this quote by a scholar named Mustafa Dikech, who studies this sort of thing. He really characterizes the gravity of the situation in France today. He says, the problem is not that republicanism is inherently incompatible with diversity. The problem is that the Republican imaginary is so white and so Christian that any manifestation of discontent by the Republic's darker and non-Christian citizens quickly evokes concerns about the principles of the Republic. This is the paradox of existing republicanism in France. Rather than a defense of the equality of all its members, republicanism becomes a denial of diversity and prevents the constitution of political spaces where the youth and banlieues can be heard as equals making a claim as part of the republic, not as barbarians at its gate. Thank you so much.